千里之行，始于足下。A journey of 1,000 miles begins beneath the feet. We now gather in the Tao to travel the journey together. Welcome to Tao Talks with Derek Lin, where we take a deep dive into the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. I would like to invite you to center your thoughts and direct your attention to this moment in time, to the here and now. To be fully present and mindfully aware as we all ready ourselves for this sacred process of the Tao. Chapter 59 has a Chinese title,長生久. So as usual, the very last character, the character on the right, just means chapter. So the first two characters are the name, represent the name of the chapter in Chinese. The very first character means long, and it can be long in terms of length, physical length. But here, it means long in terms of time. The second character will be life. So 长生 will be long life, which means longevity. So the name of the chapter in English is longevity. Now, this was always intended to be a reference to spiritual longevity, that the power of spirituality can be lasting. Throughout Chinese history, longevity has often been misinterpreted to mean physical immortality, which is an impossibility in our current state of medical knowledge and technology, and certainly was not a possibility throughout ancient Chinese history. So it really just means that when you live right in accordance with the Tao, the positive influence that you exert upon the world, on people, will long outlive your physical existence. So let's explore the chapter a little bit, see exactly what that is talking about. Last time, we went through the chapter. This is relatively short compared to the chapters that we had dealt with recently, which were in the range of 16, 17 lines. This one has 11 lines, and it has an interesting structure. So what I noted last time was that we don't have a whole lot of characters that repeat themselves from one line to the next. And by that, I am talking about looking at the Chinese characters here. Even when you just look at them, inspect them visually, you don't see that many repeating characters. The repetition in this chapter is different from the poetic repetition in the other chapters, in that here, what we have is the reiteration of 2 or 3 or 4 characters from the end of one line to the beginning of the next line. The first example we see is from the end of line 3 to the beginning of line 4. So in both cases, the characters being the same, they're translated the same. Submitting early. For these two characters, these two red characters that you see here, the first of the two means early, and the second character means to submit. So submitting early has a very specific meaning, and it's tied to the concept we're going to talk about today. And part of it is in the recap. Moving on, we see the same pattern repeating throughout from line 3 all the way down to line 9. So the last 3 characters of line 4 are the same as the first 3 characters of line 5, and it's the same between line 5 and line 6. Then we have 4 characters in line 7 that become the beginning of line 8, and then the end of line 8, the 2 characters there repeat themselves in line 9. So that's the pattern. Not as easy to spot, but it's there. And what I did was that I alternated between red and blue as the highlighting color to be able to showcase that. And once we identify those repeating elements, we're able to then mark out the distinction. The first 2 lines will be the introductory lines. Then line 3 down to line 9 will be the main body, the main part of the chapter. Section 2 is the major section, followed by 2 lines as the concluding section, the final section. So in audio production, you would say that the 2 lines, line 1 and line 2, are the intro. And then you would say that line 10 and line 11 will be the outro. So we started talking about this and we got to line 2. In line 1 and 2, in the intro, we have a couple of important concepts that we had discussed. So let me talk about those. This is still part of the recap to reiterate what we had talked about previously. So the important element from line 1, the last 2 characters, talk about serving heaven. Serving heaven does not depict a mythological heaven that you become the servant to that mythology. Serving heaven means serving the heavenly mandates of living in accordance with the Tao. So heaven in this context is oftentimes connected to Tian Li. The 2 red characters, this is the first major concept. Tian Li, where Tian means heaven, that's the first character there. Li, the second character, means reason or reasoning. So the reasoning of heaven, what is that? Well, it means justice, it means nature, the justice of nature, or the justice of the gods being avatars representing elements of nature. Thunder god representing thunder and lightning, sky god, earth god, etc. It also represents conscience. So it is believed that people are just a microscopic reflection of the world, and the world is a microscopic reflection of the heaven. The heaven is a microscopic reflection of the cosmos. Thus, that which is true and correct by the mandate of heaven is true and correct in accordance with human conscience. So I want everyone to see how that logic, that train of logic works. So when you are contrary to Tian Li, it's similar to when we in our world, in the Western world, in the modern world, when we see something so outrageous, something that is so against our common notion of what is right, someone's going to shake his head and say, oh man, that just ain't right. That expresses the feeling, very same feeling of going against Tian Li. It's against the way things ought to be. It's against the quote-unquote mandates of heaven. In reality, it's against human conscience. It is something that we know to be wrong because we have a deeply embedded feeling for what should be right, what should be wrong. And what appeals to us as being right usually falls into the realm of positive emotions like love, sharing, friendship, companionship, fellowship. What goes against it oftentimes are the negative side, the dark side of human nature. You know, the rage, the hatred, the the cruelty, torture, genocide, all that stuff. Therefore, serving heaven just means living your life in accordance with the heavenly Tao. That's the bottom line. So we have 4 items here to make that a little bit more specific. Following conscience, one's own conscience, that is your higher self. Indeed, your highest self. You let that higher self or higher self dictate what you should and should not do. You let it tell you what is right or wrong. And then follow reasoning. This refers to the human ability to reason things out, to look at something and exercise your critical faculties so that whatever was not immediately clear, you can reflect upon it and then figure it out for yourself. Then you conduct yourself in accordance with the conclusion of your reasoning process. Hence, your behavior, actions, and decisions must all fall into that which is reasonable, in accordance with the heavenly reason. Then we talk about virtue. Virtue is actually a big topic that we're going to delve into in detail today. There are complexities. There's one extra layer of complexity that usually is never exposed to a Western audience. So I intend to remedy that today and make sure everyone knows that when we talk about virtue, there's actually 2 different kinds. So we'll get to that in a moment. Lastly, follow nature. This is in reference to the natural rhythm. For instance, going through your day, certain parts of the day is devoted to productivity, to activities, to work, to dynamic action. And the rest of the day is devoted to rest, downtime, recharging your batteries. It's the yin and yang interplay in the natural rhythm of the day. So following that causes you to become especially effective, because if you are well rested, you can do your best work. And when you have done your best work, you rest easy, knowing that you have done an honest day's work. So let's continue on to the next major concept that we talked about last time, se. So this character here, one single character, actually quite important. In modern Mandarin, usually this is in context of 吝啬, which means stingy, being a miser. But se, in ancient times, in this context, doesn't mean being stingy, does not mean being a miser, as is the case with many other characters that have undergone linguistic evolution, throughout the centuries. This character, se, in ancient times meant not being wasteful, being thrift, being efficient and economical. It refers to not wasting valuable resources such as time, energy, the mind. And when I say the mind, I'm talking about devoting your attention to something, and then spirituality. Se, conservation, it means that you have the wisdom and clarity to recognize that the resources are finite in this world, in this lifetime. The time that we have in this world, we know, perhaps measured in decades, it's a finite number of years. Recognizing that is the wisdom to gather up your resources, to use them wisely in the here and now. So, the concept of being conservative, conserving resources, has a lot to do, is connected to present state mindful awareness. And this applies everywhere, to people, to heaven, And I'm going to give you an example. When a Tao master talks about this concept, conservation, he actually uses a farmer as an example. Why does he do that? Well, the Tao master says, if you look at the work of the farmer is going to mind his field. The farmer is going to look for weeds, and then he's going to remove them. He does that in order to allow his crops to grow in the best possible way. So this is the analogy. In the farmer analogy about conservation, bear with me, we'll make these things all tie together in a very nice way. When the Tao master speaks of the farmer, the Tao master is actually talking about you and me. And when the Tao master speaks of the crop, it's representative of something that you want to accomplish in your life. It may be a skill you want to master. It may be the next level of spiritual cultivation that you would like to ascend to. Whatever that goal may be, is represented by the harvest of the crops. So in order to get to that point, that milestone, you would be mindful of the weeds. So the farmer has to pay close attention to that, all the weeds that can grow in the fields, because if the farmer were to ignore the weeds, they will take away resources away from the crops. That is water and nutrients. So the weeds in life become the distractions. We can be distracted away from what we know we ought to be accomplishing or making progress on. We can be distracted by many things, especially in the colorful material world. So therefore, the resources, the valuable resources that the crops all need will be water and fertilizer. So the farmer is interested in not letting that valuable resource go to the weeds as much as possible. So resources in general for us would be what I have referred to: time, energy, mindful attention. It could also be material resources that you bring to bear to help you accomplish something. It could be a technique. It could be some meditation time that you devote to yourself. It could be study of valuable books that give you illuminated insights. Resources are meant to be general, represented by water and fertilizer in this analogy. So then, clearing out the weeds means removing distractions. So conservation plays into this because conservation is about being efficient, being practical, being economical, to not waste any time. Time is a resource. So when you remove distractions, you are removing causes of wasting time. So think of that, and then it's the same with removing distractions for the mind, because your attention is also a resource. Therefore, this ties in with what we talked about: following the mandate of heaven in serving heaven. You're clearing a path to ease your way on the Tao. And that, for the farmer, when clearing out the weeds, that allows the crop to grow naturally. It gives it the best chance possible to produce a bountiful harvest when the time comes. The correspondence to that in real life for you and me is that by removing the distractions, clearing out the weeds, you get to move naturally down the path to make smooth progress in whatever it is that you are trying to accomplish. So that is the metaphor. That is the equivalence between the two. I think this actually makes it clear. So the main idea to keep in mind here is that when you conserve your resources, water and fertilizer, resources like time, energy, mindful awareness, then you give yourself the best chance for success. So this concept is something that we have encountered before. Previously, in a previous chapter, I talked about how there's an ancient story from Zhuangzi that talks about this. In that story, there was an exchange between an emperor and a child. And the emperor was asking about the best way to run the empire. Now, I made references to this story before. I didn't get a chance to talk about it. So I think today is an opportunity for me to tell you the story and then use the story to illustrate further what we mean by this concept of conservation. So the emperor that I was talking about just now is the legendary yellow emperor called Huangdi. The legendary emperor, yellow emperor Huangdi, once upon a time had heard of a sage by the name of Tao who was known for uncommon insights. Now, because Huangdi at the time was having trouble ruling, managing his empire, he needed some advice. He needed the advice from this sage that people said was uncommonly wise. So he gathered up his 6 ministers, and they all embarked for the mountain where this sage, this legendary sage, lived. When they neared the destination, the mountain, they found themselves lost in the wilderness because they hadn't been there before. None of them, Huangdi plus his ministers, none of them knew that much about the area. So they needed someone for guidance. They needed someone for direction. So they looked around. They wanted to ask for directions. They could not see anyone. So then Huangdi, they all looked around. They separated and then looked around to get someone for help. And then Huangdi, wandering around, saw a young boy minding a horse, watching horses. So he called out to the young boy. He said, "Hey, we're heading for the mountain. Would you happen to know where that is? The Juqi mountain." And the boy said, "Oh yeah, sure. I know where that is." Now, there was something about the boy's manner that intrigued the yellow emperor. It piqued Huangdi's interest, and he decided to ask a little further. Like, you can imagine if you get an answer like that, "Yeah, sure, I know where that is." Well, why don't you just go ahead and tell me? So then Huangdi said, "Well, how about the great sage, Tao wei? Would you happen to know where he lives?" And the boy gave another nod. "Oh yeah, sure. No problem. I know where that is. I know where he is." So then Huangdi thought this boy was very unusual. He seemed so confident, so self-assured. He seemed like a know-it-all. So jokingly, Huangdi asked, "Well, I suppose next you're going to say that you know how to rule the empire, right?" And again, the boy was had the same certainty, the same confidence, was like, "Yeah, no problem, sure, I know how that is." And the boy said, "Ruling the empire is just like taking care of a horse. Why do we have to make it more complicated than that?" Then the boy said, "I'm just a little boy who likes to wander around. This morning I had a headache, I felt dizzy, so an elder told me it would help to come out here in the wilderness to to walk around a little bit. I'm feeling much better now. So I guess I'm just going to get on my way. Anyhow, governing people is similar. But it's not my job to govern people, so I should not presume to have an opinion. So then Huangdi was even more intrigued, and it was sort of like a cliffhanger. Like the boy said, yeah, I know how to do it, but yeah, it's not my job, so I'm not going to talk about it. So Huangdi is like, true, it's not your job, yes, but before you go, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by ruling the empire being just like ruling, like taking care of a horse? Tell me more, right? The boy did not respond. So Huangdi probed further, asked again, like, this is in modern times, we would be like, come on, just tell me. So after a thoughtful pause, the boy said, well, what is so different about the two activities? When you take care of a horse, think about what you have to do. You have to remove everything that is negative or harmful to the horse. That will bring out the horse's own natural vitality. The way to rule the empire is similar to that. So then Huangdi was stunned and surprised. Somehow, what the boy said was exactly what he needed to hear. The boy was implying to him that what he had to do for the empire to thrive was to remove all the elements that were negative or harmful to the empire. He bowed deeply to the boy and said, you are truly a teacher of the heavenly Tao. Now, having said that, he looked around to rejoin the others. He eventually found them, and one of them asked, Your Majesty, shall we continue our search for the sage? And Huangdi said, no. To everyone's surprise, he said, no. He said, I have the advice that I came out here to find. Let's head back to the palace. So that is the story written by Zhuangzi. And it's not really talking about Huangdi, it's really talking about life. As is often the case with the best stories from the Tao. So let's dissect it a little bit. What is the Tao of this story, Huangdi and the boy? Well, first of all, Zhuangzi wrote the story as a metaphor for life. So when he wrote about Huangdi being in search of a sage, that's actually the way that Zhuangzi expressed that, well, think of yourself as Huangdi and think of the search for the sage as being very similar to the search that we all engage in, searching for answers, searching for meaning, searching for purpose in life. At one point or another, we all think about those issues. We all think about life itself. We all would like to know, just like Huangdi would like to know. When Huangdi says, I would like to get the answer as to the best way to rule the empire, that would be very similar to us asking the question, I would like to find out the answer as to the best way that I can live my life. That's the idea. So when Zhuangzi wrote that Huangdi was lost in the wilderness, that mirrors us being unsure in life, uncertain. We don't know which way to go. We look this way and that. We don't quite find what we're looking for. We're sort of like wandering around, stumbling around in the fog, not being able to see our way. We know as we live our lives, we kind of know, we have a sense that we're not living up to our true potential. But then how do we turn things around? Not quite sure. When we do that, when that happens, most people tend to just like try anything, like strike out in a random direction, hoping to find the right path by chance. And this is why people flock to teachers of various paths, various forms of spirituality, and read books on various techniques. They keep on adding more and more knowledge, searching for the answer. Now, for many people, this doesn't necessarily result in a successful search. That is, they don't necessarily find the one thing that resonates with them, such as Huangdi has done in the story. So, what is the better way? Rather than to search around randomly, trying one thing after another, through the young boy, Zhuangzi is saying that, well, don't add complexity to your life. The Tao is about simplifying, not making things more complex. You want to simplify, you want to reduce the elements that are negative or harmful. So you got to keep in mind here in this story, you are the caretaker, the young boy. You are also the horse. The horse represents the empire in the story. It represents your life. You got to be able to navigate among those different levels of the metaphor. Okay? So what the young boy is pointing out is that your life has a natural vitality, like the empire does, like a horse does. In order for you to thrive as a person, to live a meaningful life, what you want to do is to reduce the negative elements, the elements that hold you back, the elements that get in the way, the distractions. So what might be some of those elements be? So here are some examples, and you can probably come up with your own. First is what I call the A's, the addictions, the attachments. When I talk about attachments, I want to be clear that I am not referring to just material things. Attachments can take many different forms. For instance, you may harbor a grudge against someone. That grudge is a form of attachment. It's an attachment to anger, resentment, thoughts of vengeance, thoughts of getting even. That attachment has to be reduced or relinquished. Another example, you may be dwelling on sadness about something in the past. Maybe it was a tragic event from the past, a defeat, a setback, or something you did or said that later on you have cause to regret. So that will be an attachment too if you keep reliving the past, unable to let go. You're grasping onto that attachment to sadness. And yet another example is that there might have been something good that happened in the past, what we call the old days, the good old days, the glory days. You may live in the past, you may be reliving past glories again and again, so much so that it becomes escapism. Escapism numbs you to the less than glorious present. So as an example, think about the people who perhaps hit their peak back in high school and have been on decline ever since. So they keep thinking, they keep recalling to mind the fond memories of the glory days from high school. You know, what we might call the Al Bundy syndrome. So that would also be an attachment. So this is the A's, addictions, attachments, quite different. But these are negative elements to reduce or let go of so that you can allow yourself to thrive. Another category will be the C's, what I call the C's, and that's negativity in the form of complaints, criticisms, clutter in life, and the clutter can be mental, physical, spiritual. Clutter will be what we call baggage that we can't quite let go of. Physical clutter, reduce the amount of space that we have. Mental clutter, actually the same, but in the mental landscape. Spiritual clutter, maybe there are things from the past, beliefs that no longer serve you, that it's time to re-examine these old beliefs and let some of them go. To detach from those kinds of attachments. Then there's the I's. Inertia, indecisiveness. The I's lead to procrastination, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But these are all negative elements, harmful elements in one's life, that if you are able to reduce them or to let them go, then you can truly thrive. Now, let me explain what this has to do with the chapter that we're studying now. The concept we're focusing on is conservation. Conservation means, listen, save your resources. Don't waste them. Don't waste your time. Don't waste your energy. Focus on the right path. Conservation maps neatly to these ideas from Zhuangzi, because when you let go of distractions, you are avoiding further waste of time spent on those distractions. So then previously in chapter 57, a couple of chapters ago, we talked about this. And that chapter talks about how the sage ruler takes unattached action and then people transform themselves. That's another way of saying the same thing, that you don't waste time, that you are more efficient and more economical, and you allow the natural vitality to manifest. Whether it's an empire, it's a horse, or most importantly, your life. Hence, this maps to what we're talking about. In governing people and serving heaven, there is nothing like conservation. So I enjoy the story and the fact that the current chapter gives it yet another layer of wisdom. The Tao is always coming in multiple layers of meaning. So this particular story, Huangdi and the boy, comes from the book, The Tao of Happiness. Part 3 of the book is travel tips. And the whole book is organized according to different parts of a journey or a quest of spirituality. And hence, we have part 3 being travel tips. And the 4th story in part 3 is Huangdi and the boy. So if you are interested in that, there's more that you can explore. Now, let's continue on. We're about to talk about another concept that ties in very neatly with everything that we have just discussed. Line 3 says, only with conservation is it called submitting early. So now I want to focus on these two characters, submitting early. The last two characters from line 3, Zao Fu. So the pinyin is exactly as you see there. They look fairly close to the actual sound. Literally, the first character means early, and the second character means submit. Early submit, submitting early, it has a meaning that's a little bit deeper than just the surface appearance. it goes back to the overall idea that the Tao is something that does not require striving or struggles. Indeed, the Tao is about that which is graceful and smooth. So if you are struggling and striving, what this teaching says is that you can actually give that up. You can actually let that go. You don't have to struggle. You don't have to strive. You can end the strife as soon as possible. In life, this means stop going against the Tao. Now, you may say, well, I'm not going against the Tao. Well, the purpose of submitting early, Lao Tzu wrote those two characters specifically because he was aware that there are those who resist or drag their feet as far as starting their own cultivation. And he's saying that, well, look, everybody is free to do exactly as they wish. But I'm telling you, it is in your best interest to start on the path as early as possible, as soon as possible. Therefore, submitting early. And stop going against the Tao also means that you want to disengage from debates. So remember, debating is overall really just a losing proposition. It's opposed to the Tao. It's a bad idea. So you don't really need to waste any time and energy in debates. They usually go nowhere. When we say going against the Tao, we're talking about like swimming against the current. When you swim against the current, you don't really get far and you tire yourself out. And it's also referring to things like stop exploring all the side paths that try to entice you with all kinds of promises of secrets, secret techniques, success, instant success. All the advertising, all the infomercials, all the marketing, the purpose of the side paths is to separate you from your resources, especially cash. So walk the plain path of the Tao. The Tao is this even avenue. It's boring to walk on it, but it is safe and it's easy to walk, rather than the side paths that promise a lot but then deliver little. And we're going to continue with this concept, submitting early, and exactly what it means in the context of the Tao Te Ching. We're going to take a look at the entire line 3, together as one entity. Only with conservation is it called submitting early. So Tao sages are well aware that some people will drag their feet when it comes to the Tao. They will be resistant, like, it's not, the time is not right for me. I'll get into it later on when I have more time. The excuses are many. It could be your modern days. It could be work. I'm too busy with work. It could be school. I'm too busy with school. It could be family. Oh, when my kids are grown, then maybe I can spend more time on spiritual cultivation and so on. There are many, many examples. If it's work, it may be when I'm done, I've got a lot of projects going on right now, so I am super busy. When I'm done with these projects, then I will do XYZ. With family, with the kids, when I'm not so busy taking care of my kids, when they're out of kindergarten, when they're out of elementary school, when they're out of high school, when they're out of college, etc., I will do ABC. So many, many different excuses. Lao Tzu is pointing out in this chapter that Okay, fine. But listen, keep in mind that our time is limited. Our time in this world. And here's something that I'm going to agree with wholeheartedly. The best time to start Tao cultivation is many years ago. I am grateful that I began more than 20 years ago. The second best time, if you did not start many years ago, the second best time to start is right now. So everybody comes to the Tao differently through different paths in different circumstances. So I don't know exactly how it was for you, but if you hadn't already started and been doing it for years, the time to start is now. Frankly, I believe you will thank yourself later. So now, let me tie the two together, conservation and submitting early. It's actually quite easy. Take a look at this. Apply the wisdom to conserve, and conserve, the character there that you see is se. In ancient context, it means to not waste. First, I'm dividing this up into two parts, the unwise and the wise. Keep in mind that all of us gathered together here right now, we've been both. In our lives, we've been unwise and we've been wise in different times, different circumstances. Sometimes we live up to the ideal, other times we don't. That's just reality. So I'm gonna characterize unwise and the wise in terms of getting things done, like working on a particular project or a task. Usually, very often, we find that we have a set amount of time to get something done. If it's a project, perhaps the project has a deadline. In the case of a recent endeavor, it may be, for example, when you, as a student, you want to study for an exam, and you know the exam is going to happen on a particular date, you want to prepare for that. The preparation leading up to the exam, that's a project too. When faced with something like that, you have a certain amount of time, and you have some things that need to be accomplished. The unwise will usually say throughout most of that process, oh, I still have time. Tomorrow, I will start. Next week, I will start. Next month, I will start. Right now, I'm focusing on something else. Don't bother me right now. I'll get back to it. I'll circle back with you. What about the wise? The wise will look at the project or the task, and the very first thing that the wise will do is to gain clarity on the amount of time. When is this due? How much time do I have? And tasks, that is, what are the things that I have to do? What are the tasks and the subtasks that I need to accomplish in order to finish the overall objective? Instead of, oh, I still have time, the wise will figure out exactly how much time that means. So then when you say, I still have time, that results in wasting time. It results in procrastination. And I am not exempting myself from this discussion, everybody. I, in my life, have often procrastinated in the past. I am happy to say that I found a lot of help and support by learning and studying and understanding the Tao and then applying that to myself. So I'm able to cure my own procrastination when I understand the philosophy at a deeper level. So hopefully I have gone from being unwise, at least in some respects, to being wiser. The wise, having gained clarity on time versus things to be done, will then incrementally work on those tasks. That is, divide them up within the space allocated as far as the timeline, and then that gives you the clarity on what has to be completed by what time. So the result is that for the unwise, you grow increasingly desperate at the 11th hour. You leave everything until the last minute. When that gets closer, you feel anxious. You wish you could have started earlier, but then by that time, it is too late. So then desperation drives you. At the 11th hour, you're running around wondering what to do. What is the quick cure? What is a miracle? Who do you pray to for help? The wise, when things get close to the end, is still on track, still relaxed. So I'm happy to say that since I was able to do something about my own procrastination, I've been on the right side of this more often than not. Then for the unwise, eventually time runs out. And that's usually when disaster occurs because of the lack of preparation. Things are not done, things are not ready. Whereas for the wise, it's a smooth handling of the approaching deadline, where the deadline is really nothing special. It's just another one of the many milestones in the timeline that the wise has already set up. No surprises, very well prepared. So overall, if you think about the difference between the two, to conserve is not just time, it's not just energy, it's economy and efficiency in every aspect of life. It's doing things in the most direct way possible, no beating around the bush. It's also about efficient economy of expression, no beating around the bush in terms of you don't have to couch what you say in a lot of fancy phrases. You can just come directly to the point. So in conclusion, you can see the unwise usually think they have plenty of time until time runs out. And if they wait until the last minute, or in my expression here, the 11th hour, it just means that they have already wasted a lot of time that they will never get back. To be wise means you have to have this clear view on where you are in the overall process, which is to say, how much have you done so far? How much is yet to be done? And how much time is left? In this way, you avoid wasting your time, which is a resource. You avoid wasting your other resources. You conserve. And let me also speak of time itself. As long as we have the clock here, I want to talk about time as a limited resource in the sense that we all have 24 hours a day. It is therefore up to us to use what we have, what we all have efficiently, and not waste too much of it. So then let's continue on. In order to see this, right now, we're at the stage of conservation. You can see, yeah, we're conserving time by being efficient, by planning ahead. That makes sense. Now I want you to do, I want to take this right here and expand it to encompass an entire lifetime, as if your life is a giant project. So here's how that works. You're going to see the correspondence. And I'll use a calendar here instead of a clock to represent that. Well, we talked about how there's only 24 hours in a day. So in a sense, a lifetime is limited in a similar way. It's not a set number of hours like it is with a day, but a lifetime. We know we'll have a certain amount of time, usually measured in decades. There, it is also up to us to use what we have efficiently and not waste too much of it. So the unwise in living life, the correspondence to I still have time, I'm still searching. Yeah, I'm still searching. I'm still searching for myself. I'm still searching for answers. I'm still searching for meaning. I haven't found it yet. I'm still searching for my place in the world, my purpose in life. The wise would be thinking in a different way. The wise would convert that thinking. The wise can also engage in a search. But the wise is aware that a question like this, what is the answer in life? What is the purpose? What is the meaning? What's my place in it? Why am I here? That question is not a new question. It's not something that we're asking for the first time in human history. It is something that every human being has asked in every generation. Going back to the beginning of humanity, it's a very ancient question. It's as old as humanity. Therefore, many people in the past have already dealt with the question. Some of them were a lot wiser than we are. They have jotted down their answers. They have blazed a trail. They have pointed to the path, the Tao. And we're in a position to take advantage of that. We can stand on the shoulder of giants and look further. We can leverage what they have done so we don't waste time. So we don't have to expend a lot of energy unnecessarily. Thus, the wise understand what it means to leverage ancient wisdom. The unwise, rather than to do that, would try one thing after another. Usually, whatever's fashionable, faddish, whatever happens to be all the rage. Try one thing after another, never quite finding the answer, or finding something only to find out after a short time that it isn't right after all, or it doesn't work. The wise will get started on the path of spiritual cultivation, whatever form that takes, as soon as possible. This is where you begin to see the connection between submitting early and conserving. When you submit early, you save a lot of time and effort. So as the years wear on, as time goes on, you get closer and closer to the end of a lifetime. The unwise will still be searching, will still be trying one thing after another, and will be feeling lost in terms of life direction. The wise, having started early on the path, will now be moving forward with definite purpose. There is a joy and happiness in that definitive purpose that you possess as you move forward. So that is the difference. And that's how we connect the dots, connect between conserving and quote unquote submitting early. That's a concept that doesn't really have a Western equivalent. It basically just means, look, just get into this as early as you possibly can. Stop the dilly-dallying around. You're gonna thank yourself later. Let's move on to line 4. Line 4 has yet another important concept that we should discuss in detail. And we start with the character. This is the third from last character, or the 5th character from, if you count from the beginning. It's 重. It means heavy. So 重 in modern Mandarin means heavy. Here, It doesn't mean heavy in terms of mass or weight. Here, in this ancient context, it's a related meaning, but not exactly the same as modern Mandarin. It means heavy emphasis. It means stressing or emphasizing a particular thing. So what it emphasizes is the last two characters, 积德. So together, 重积德. And what that means is the accumulation of virtues. The very last character means virtue, and the character right before that is the accumulation thereof. The accumulation of virtues, what is that? Well, I provide a quick example here. For instance, reading books that are helpful to you about the Tao, that's an accumulation of virtue because it increases your understanding. That by itself is not enough. You must still apply what you understand, but it's the beginning of it. Contemplation, reflection about life, that can also be the accumulation of virtue. Real life application, okay, that is when you take what you know and then use that in day-to-day living. Now, when I get to this point, this is the important part where I need to talk about the different kinds of accumulating virtues. As I mentioned in the beginning of our talk today, this is a topic that's commonly taught in genuine, authentic traditions of the Tao. So in Asian traditions, there is a distinction being made for the different kinds of virtues that you can accumulate. I want to convey that, I want to explain that to everybody because as far as I can see, there's really no other source for this information that's commonly available. So the two kinds of virtue, there's the virtue of prosperity, and then there's the virtue of merit. 福德. The first two characters here, 福德 literally means virtue of prosperity, where the first character is prosperity or abundance, and then the second character is virtue. The character in the middle means and, A-N-D, and then the last two characters, 功德. 功德 is the virtue of merit. So what is the difference between the virtue of prosperity and the virtue of merit? Let's find out. I've got two columns here. On the left, the virtue of prosperity. Remember, that's 福德. And then on the right, we've got 功德, the virtue of merit. The virtue of prosperity is what happens when you interact with people, when you interact with the world. Therefore, it is externally directed. It's what you do in the world. Conversely, the virtue of merit is what happens internally. That's what happens in the heart, in the mind, in the spirit. It's internally directed. When you do a good deed, that's external. When you reflect upon the Tao teachings and arrive at an epiphany, that's internal. Okay, so you can accumulate virtues in different ways. Doing a good deed is a virtue of prosperity. Having a realization, having awakening, enlightened consciousness, that's the virtue of merit. So external versus internal. Therefore, the externally directed virtue of prosperity, 福德, it has to do with the material world. And the method of interaction is material in nature. Like material assistance. I give you something that will help you. That will be material assistance. Whereas the virtue of merit is in the intangible spiritual realm. It's about spirituality versus the material world. So it's the tangible versus the intangible. Things versus thoughts. Now, the virtue of prosperity In the Zen Buddhist tradition, it is pointed out that this is ultimately illusory. Why? Well, because the material world itself, everything in it, everyone in it, the fleshly bodies that we inhabit, the things that we use, all the physical objects, they are all impermanent and transient. They keep changing, they come and go. They are here and then they are gone, like a candle flame that flickers in and then goes out. So ultimately, it is as if they are unreal, that they don't really exist. They're transient, they are illusory. Conversely, the intangible is ultimately real. In this unreal world, the only real thing are the spiritual selves, the true nature, the self nature, the true self. We individually, although we're not able to really categorize or explain or point to it or hold on to it, you can't contain something like the soul. It is ultimately real in a world that is ultimately illusory. So if you do something good, if you do a good deed, if you give something great to someone that's very helpful, that's great. But recognize that it's all transient. You must also pay attention to the merit that when you accumulate that, it is what you refine in your spirit, and therefore it is what you keep. So furthermore examples, because the virtual prosperity is all about dealing with other people, dealing with the world, it's what happens when you see the suffering of others. That's sensory input. That's when you look at things and then you feel compassion. The looking of it, the observing of it, that's your interaction with the material world. What about internal? Well, it is said in the Zen Buddhist tradition, and this is very true, that when you are able to see the truth of self-nature, when you look at all this, and when you begin to understand that, wow, ultimately, this individualness, this me-ness that I can't really define, more than anything else that I touch, that I use in the material world, this is what's real. When you are able to see that truth, when you are able to comprehend it and become one with it, that's the virtue of merit. Now, just looking at these two, you can see that it's not a question of one or the other. In the third bullet here, when I say ultimately illusory and ultimately real, you may think, as I did many, many years ago, that, oh yeah, well, we should discount the virtue of prosperity and focus on the virtue of merit. That is the misconception that I had. When I get to the fourth bullet, my realization is that we gotta have both. We must cultivate both the virtue of prosperity and the virtue of merit. We cannot be indifferent to the suffering of others. We cannot neglect the practice to see the truth of self-nature. Both sides, both columns are actually necessary. They actually feed into each other. So further examples of that, when you give to charity, that's the virtue of prosperity. Why? Well, it's the external world, it's material. And note that because it is tied to the material world, giving to charity can be categorized into doing it for selfless, natural compassion, or it can also be done in a way as to further one's own personal glory. So it can be positive or negative by itself because it's tied to the material world. So then, instead of just the giving to charity, which is giving of something material, on the virtue of merit side, it is all about the natural compassion that you cultivate when you have practiced your virtues, the virtue of compassion, and being compassionate becomes second nature to you. This bullet point is also where you can see how the two sides can feed into one another, can support one another, and be dependent on one another. Feeling the natural flow of compassion from the heart can inspire one to give to charity. Then it goes from the inside, it goes from the heart to the outside, to the world. When you see the giving to charity, when you see the suffering of poverty, that can inspire the natural flow of compassion within. Thus, the two sides are complementary dualities. So then, giving to charity is related to this bullet here, support religious practice. So this is what one ancient emperor, Liang Wudi, had done. He supported the religious practice of his time, which was Buddhism. He built hundreds of temples. He supported thousands of monks, and he looked to that as virtue, except he, at the time, did not know the difference between Fu De and Gong De, prosperity versus merit. So supporting religious practice is external to yourself, whereas a focus on self-cultivation is internally directed. So I think you begin to really get, I think you're comfortable now with the difference between the two. There is no doubt that external support of charity or religious practice can be a valuable contribution to society. No doubt about that. You help relieve the suffering of sentient beings. That's worthy of commendation, worthy of praise. But look on the right side. The right side is the path where you cultivate for the priceless Tao. The valuable contribution I'm talking about on the left-hand side, oftentimes people will put a number on it. Example, a philanthropist has given $1 million to a charitable organization. That 1 million, that one with the following zeros, that's a number. Whereas cultivating for the priceless Tao, can't put a price tag on it. Overall, as I mentioned, it's actually the yin and yang of virtues. So the virtue, this whole concept of virtue is composed of both the external and the internal. It's got to be done in the material world, but also internally, spiritually. Part of it is ultimately illusory. That doesn't mean we don't do it. And it has to do with how they evolve into one another, that they circle one another and transform from one to the other. So as I said, the distinction between the two is often taught in authentic traditions in Asia, but usually never mentioned in the West. Enlightened cultivators of the Tao engage in both kinds of virtues. They do not let one side obscure the other. Let's move on. Line 5. Accumulating virtues means there is nothing one cannot overcome. So that's a double negative there. I'll talk about that in just a moment. First, let me point out that we have 3 repeating characters. 无不克, 无不克. You see it at the end of line 5 and then again at line 6. So I want to single it out. 无不克. The pinyin looks like this, and I want to note here that the last one is not K, it's not Ki, it's Ke. So the pinyin system is kind of funny like that sometimes. 无不克. Literally, so here's what it means, and this is where the double negative comes in. 无 means to not have any, to have none. 不 is a negative as well. It means cannot, or just not sometimes. And then the last character, ke, that means overcome. So literally, you see, none cannot overcome. What it means is there is nothing one cannot overcome. And that, in turn, flip that around, you get, you can overcome everything because there is nothing you cannot overcome. Hopefully that's clear. You reverse the double negative into a positive that usually makes it a little bit easier to understand. You can overcome anything, any obstacles. So then let's do the entire line. Accumulating virtues means there is nothing one cannot overcome. What this says is that the previous slide, when we talked about the accumulation, the virtue of merit and the virtue of prosperity, that's actually extremely powerful. It's a gradual accumulation, a little bit every day. It's not particularly exciting in the conventional sense. So what is the power? I say here the accumulation of virtues is very powerful. What do I mean by that? Well, in this particular page, in this line, it says it can overcome anything. So let me give you a visual that will drive the point home. Look at this, a plant, okay? A plant is a favorite example in the Tao practice, in Tao teachings. The plant grows gradually, a little bit every day. If you're just looking at a plant, you cannot perceptibly see the growth. It is so slow and so gradual that you cannot see the growth happening. So that is a good metaphor for the gradual accumulation of virtues. It doesn't seem to be doing much at any one time, and yet as it grows, it's powerful enough to crack concrete, as you see in this image. So use that as your mental image to represent this, that accumulating virtues, gradual growth, means that you end up being able to overcome anything, and use cracking concrete as your visual for that. So that's pretty much all the time that we have today. There's still a lot of good stuff to talk about in this chapter. We're going to need to wait until next time. For now, we have just enough time to jump to the very end to do a quick summary for today. What have we talked about so far today? Well, we've talked about some parts of this. We luckily have been able to cover every one of the points, every one of the 4 points in this summary slide, which is part 1 of 2. And next time we get to cover the second set of 4 points. So progressing in the Tao, the first step is conservation. And what it means is exactly as you see here, our days and resources in this lifetime are finite. Therefore, you want to utilize them in the wisest, most efficient way possible. You want to conserve. The second step, the second stage, is to submit early. And what it means is that, listen, the sooner you start walking the path of the Tao, the better. And then the third phase is accumulating virtues. what we were just talking about, the virtue of merit and the virtue of prosperity. They are, don't fall into the mistake of assuming that one is better than the other. In this world, we need both. And when you see the image of the plant cracking concrete, you want to remember the power of small, gradual changes over time. And then, number 4, overcome all obstacles. Nothing can stand in your way. So those are the 4 that I wanted to cover today, and it worked out perfectly. We're able to talk. Our meeting has come to an end, but the journey continues on. Let us all travel safely so we can meet again. Until next time, may the Tao fill you with peace and happiness.